Welcome to the historic Blood, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now we begin with Story 1. The Leech Keepers of Worcester, Life in a Monastic Infirmary. You awaken not in a noble castle or bustling village square, but in the cloistered calm of a 12th century monastic infirmary, specifically the infirmary at Worcester Cathedral Priory in England. The air here is moist with herbal steam and the faint scent of blood. Outside, monks chant in the dim morning light, their voices filtering through thick stone walls. But here inside, healing is the day's true liturgy. The monastic infirmary was not just a place of care. It was a world unto itself, carved out by necessity and belief. Few modern visitors to the ruins of monastic buildings would suspect just how vital and advanced these spaces were in the tapestry of medieval health care. Infirmaries were usually long, narrow halls with high windows designed for airflow. Beds lined the walls, made of straw-stuffed mattresses and woolen blankets. Patients, often aged monks, injured travelers, or poor laypeople, lay quietly. Illness was seen as both physical ailment and spiritual trial, and the infirmary stood at the intersection of both. The leech keeper, or herudinator, was not a figure of fiction. He had a real and documented role. Leeches, known for their medicinal bleeding properties, were kept in earthen pots submerged in cool water. The herudinator collected them from nearby marshes and riverbanks at dawn, using a leg of fresh meat as bait. At Worcester, records from the priory's customals, essentially manuals of daily life, reveal a methodical approach to healing. A monk assigned to the infirmary would wake before lauds, light the fire under the herb boiler, and prepare compresses using wool soaked in warmed wine or vinegar. The herb garden outside the infirmary door was as vital as any chapel. Feverfew for headaches, comfrey for broken bones, and yarrow for bleeding cuts were among the many plants used not as supplements, but as primary medicine. But perhaps most fascinating was the dual nature of care, medical and religious. Every wound was a reflection of both physical decay and moral failing. The leeching of blood was not merely about humoral balance, it was symbolic too. To remove a portion of blood was to remove sin or excess. It is why the bleeding often occurred on specific days aligned with saints' feasts or lunar phases. Interestingly, the infirmary was not merely reactive. Monks kept detailed health calendars. They recorded when brothers suffered from stomach ailments, coughs, or fluxes, diarrhea. They would adjust diet's broths for the ill, more ale or fewer legumes depending on the perceived imbalance of humors. The food itself was tailored to healing. Patients received what was known as infirmarian's bread, a softer, easier to digest loaf baked separately. Ale was standard but weaker, and patients drank it warm. Milk was rarely used, it was thought to cause phlegm. Fish was favored over meat for those with fevers. Eggs, boiled to a near jelly, were given to the weak. In the back corner of the infirmary, separated by a curtain, was the dying chamber or misericordia. Here, patients not expected to recover received extreme unction and confessions. But even this act was healing, spiritually if not bodily. Records show that sometimes men left this chamber and recovered a miracle, or perhaps the power of warmth, rest, and care. Physicians were rare in these halls. Most of the healing work was done by monastic brethren trained by tradition. Yet some monks, like Brother Aelred of Worcester, had reputations that extended beyond the priory walls. Aelred was known for his salve-making skills, especially his theriac, an herbal compound thought to cure poisons and plague. His theriac contained over 20 ingredients, including opium, honey, frankincense, and even ground viper flesh. Even mental illness, though poorly understood, was noted and treated. A monk given to uncontrollable weeping might be assigned additional prayers or placed under the watch of a spiritual counselor. Records suggest that soothing sounds, dim lighting, and specific herbs such as St. John's wort were used for those considered melancholic. Yet this sanctuary was not without its limitations. Amputations were rare and seen as extreme. Trepanning, the drilling of holes in the skull, was never performed here. Instead, seizures were treated with fasting and prayer. Disease was never just disease. It was a moral story unfolding in the flesh. The monks were observers as much as healers. They tracked outcomes: who lived, who died, who lingered. They annotated these results in their marginalia, not for scientific review, but for spiritual reflection. And yet, through these quiet, disciplined records, we today gain glimpses of rudimentary clinical tracking and medical experimentation. And then, of course, there were the leeches. Leeches were not randomly applied. They were placed carefully along the temples for headaches, behind the ears for fevers, or on the lower legs for gout. The process could take hours. The leeches would feed until swollen, then be placed back into their earthen pots and fasted for a time before reuse. Leech keepers sometimes had to replace them weekly, as some did not survive. There were even minor scandals noted. Leech theft from rival monasteries was not unheard of. The paradox of the infirmary lies here. Within these quiet walls, in dim candlelight and beneath thick wool blankets, patients sometimes received care that, by medieval standards, bordered on enlightened. And this care was offered not by physicians in shining robes, but by quiet men in brown habits who saw illness as a pathway to grace. The infirmary was not only a place of treatment, but of controlled routine. The monks believed in structure as a path to healing: meals at set hours, medication at set intervals, hymns at specific moments. Even the sick were expected to observe parts of the daily rhythm, though modified. The predictability was its own form of therapy. And what happened to those who were healed? Most returned to the dormitory, thinner perhaps, but spiritually renewed. Some, like Brother Edric, stayed on to help others, having seen both sides of the infirmary wall. Others were quietly moved to the cemetery. Life, death, and everything between passed through the care of men who believed that tending to the body was also tending to the soul. But was this humble routine, these soft applications of herbs and heat, more effective than we assume today? Did the stability and personal attention, the enforced rest and warm meals, offer a deeper kind of healing? And perhaps more curiously, how did a man like Brother Aelred come to create a theriac, believed to rival the apothecaries of London? When we last wandered the corridors of Worcester's monastic infirmary, we paused at the door to Brother Aelred's apothecary, a dim room, thick with the aroma of boiling herbs, where history, faith, and chemistry mixed in equal measure. Now we step inside. The theriac was not Aelred's invention. Its origins lay in the medical traditions of the ancient Greco-Roman world. Originally formulated by Andromachus, Nero's physician, theriac was a complex electuary, essentially a spiced herbal paste intended as a panacea. By the time it reached medieval England, it had evolved into something far more symbolic, a weapon against poison, plague, and demonic illness alike. Brother Aelred's version, like many monastic remedies, was adapted from Latin texts. Monks copied Galen and Dioscorides by hand, translating their recipes into everyday practice. Aelred, known among the brethren for his careful handwriting and precise measurements, was entrusted with Worcester's Liber Medicinalis, a kind of medical cookbook. Here, among its folios, was a page stained with resin and ink, his recipe. The ingredients were drawn from the priory's own physic garden and its extended network of trade. Honey came from the monastery's hives, opium poppies from the southern hedgerows. Cinnamon, myrrh, and cassia came through merchants from the Levant. These were rare and expensive. The prior approved their use only for serious cases or plague outbreaks. The preparation was ritualistic, powdered ingredients ground by mortar and pestle, then slowly stirred into boiled honey and aged wine. A dash of vinegar cut the sweetness. The final compound, once cooled, was stored in ceramic jars wrapped in linen. Aelred's version included crushed dried rose petals for purification and a small shaving of viper flesh. Yes, a viper. The inclusion of snake flesh had persisted since Roman times, based on the idea that a poison's antidote lay in the poison itself. To acquire it, Aelred corresponded with a Benedictine contact near Salisbury, who specialized in handling venomous creatures. Such ingredients were stored separately, marked with skulls drawn in red ink. To take the theriac, patients were given a spoonful, sometimes mixed in wine or warm broth. For fevers, it was administered slowly in 3 intervals across a day. For suspected poison, monks administered it immediately and prayed through the night. Whether it worked is difficult to prove by modern standards, but monks recorded recoveries in the margins of their medical books, along with symbols: a cross for survival, a skull for death, and a star for unexplained or miraculous healing. This rudimentary tracking formed a kind of proto-medical research. Meanwhile, beyond Brother Aelred's chamber, the infirmary developed as a hub of slow innovation. Other monks began modifying treatments based on seasonal changes. They noted that certain broths helped more in spring fevers than winter ones. Observations of pulse, called beating of the vessel, were also recorded, though with no true understanding of circulation. One of the most detailed records we have from Worcester comes from the infirmarian's observations, a document now lost to fire but referenced in later writings. In it, monks recorded the effects of bloodletting, noting optimal times according to the moon. Bleeding was usually performed during the waning phase, when it was thought the body was naturally in decline and would purge itself more effectively. Monks also debated where to bleed: the cephalic vein for headaches, the basilic for chest complaints, the saphenous for leg issues. They used small iron lancets and ceramic bowls to catch the blood, measuring it with marked spoons. The average letting was around 8 ounces more for strong men, less for the elderly. Some monks suffered from dizziness, others fainted. It was seen not as danger, but as cleansing. Infirmary care was communal. While Aelred crafted compounds and managed ingredients, novices carried water, changed linens, and ground herbs. Lay brothers handled cleaning and firewood. Visiting physicians, rare but occasionally invited, were watched closely. If a secular doctor prescribed a treatment, Aelred would copy the method into the priory's book, always noting whether it succeeded or failed. Not all treatments were herbal or humoral. The psychological, though they would never use such a word, mattered too. For melancholia or deep sadness, Aelred prescribed violet syrup, dried dates soaked in wine, and exposure to birdsong. Patients were also placed near windows or allowed short walks in the cloister. One case mentions a monk with grief so intense after his brother's death that he refused food for 4 days. Aelred gave him warm goat's milk with honey and instructed him to recite Psalm 42 each morning. "Why art thou cast down, O my soul?" The idea was simple: routine and beauty could heal what medicine could not. Even the layout of the infirmary reflected this belief. Beds were placed to face east when possible, toward the rising sun and the altar. The sick heard prayers at dawn and vespers at dusk, sung by monks in the hallway if they could not attend in person. Sound was considered a balm, particularly Gregorian chant, which was thought to restore harmony to the soul and body alike. Among the more curious cases documented was the illness of Brother Athelric, who developed persistent flux after eating spoiled eel. The priory's cook was briefly censured. Athelric was treated with a binding mixture of blackberry root, nutmeg, and flour boiled into a porridge. After several days, the monks reported a full recovery, and blackberry root was added to their list of staple remedies. There were failures too. During a particularly bad winter, a coughing illness spread through the infirmary. 6 monks died within 2 weeks. Aelred tried theriac, hot compresses, and chest rubs made from goose fat and camphor. Nothing worked. The deaths were recorded without embellishment, only the note, "Fevers came. Brethren departed." In the quiet after that outbreak, the infirmary received a donation, a portable brass astrolabe intended to help calculate the best times for treatment. Though crude, it allowed Aelred to align treatments with planetary hours, a practice merging science and superstition. Jupiter was seen as benevolent, Mars dangerous. Bloodletting was never performed under Mars. This strange fusion of empirical observation and celestial influence defined the age. Aelred may have taken detailed notes and adjusted his remedies based on seasons, but he also read omens in the behavior of birds and the cloud patterns. Healing was both ritual and experiment. By the end of Aelred's life, the infirmary had developed a reputation. Traveling pilgrims sometimes asked to be treated there, donating coins or cloth in exchange. Aelred's theriac was sought after by other priories. One monk even traveled from York to learn his method. Aelred never claimed credit. He believed the healing came from God. The ingredients were merely instruments. Still, one wonders how much of what he did was spiritual, and how much was the careful attention of a man who watched, recorded, and dared to adjust his methods. The great irony is that, in a world so governed by faith and tradition, men like Aelred were quietly practicing the roots of science. They observed, they modified, they tracked outcomes, and in doing so they preserved not just lives but knowledge. Today, few remember Aelred of Worcester. His name is absent from major medical histories. His writings were likely destroyed in the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. But for decades, perhaps more, his hands shaped the care of the sick and the structure of monastic medicine in England. But how did this forgotten monk's healing methods spread beyond the cloister? And what became of the knowledge he so carefully recorded? The death of Brother Aelred around the mid-12th century marked not the end of his healing legacy, but the beginning of its quiet migration beyond the monastery walls. Infirmaries like the one at Worcester had long been places where knowledge incubated slowly, passed from monk to monk through whispered instructions, careful demonstration, and the scribbled marginalia of shared texts. But in the years after Aelred's death, a shift began to occur, first in monasteries, and then in the broader landscape of English medicine. The careful structure of care that Aelred helped shape, his detailed compound remedies, his case observations, his time-based routines, began appearing in other priory records, sometimes under his name, sometimes unattributed, but unmistakably similar. The copyist's role in knowledge transfer. In a monastic world built on script and scripture, the act of copying was sacred, and it was through this slow, deliberate labor that Aelred's formulations endured. His Liber Medicinales, likely a composite of older Latin sources and his own adjustments, was transcribed by successive monks at Worcester. One copy was gifted to the infirmary at Reading Abbey, another made its way to St. Albans. Marginal notes in these later manuscripts referenced the Worcester method when describing bloodletting schedules and theriac recipes. The telltale ingredients, rose petals, viper meat, vinegar, appear again and again in these mirrored formulas. Sometimes adaptations followed geography. Monks at northern abbeys lacked access to imported cinnamon or myrrh and substituted local equivalents, bog myrtle or ground juniper. But the process remained essentially Aelred: collect, refine, observe. The books themselves, hand-bound in leather and sealed with wax, were kept in locked armaria wooden cupboards in monastic libraries. Only a select few had keys. Among them were the infirmarians, the herbalists, and occasionally visiting secular scholars. The bridge to secular medicine. In the early 13th century, a quiet revolution was brewing. Universities were forming. Salerno in Italy had already developed a reputation as a medical school by the late 11th century, and soon Oxford and Paris followed. These new centers of learning attracted scholars from across Europe, including monks. It was here that the lines between religious and secular healing began to blur. Some monastic manuscripts found their way into these schools. Medical masters copied parts of them into compendiums. Latin remained the lingua franca of science, so translations were not needed, only patience and penmanship. By the mid-13th century, certain remedies traceable to monastic infirmaries, including Worcester's, appeared in broader medical texts like the Compendium Medicinae by Gilbertus Anglicus. His recipes for fever broths and melancholia tonics bear striking resemblance to those used at Worcester down to the honeyed goat's milk and rose infusions. And so, knowledge born in the silent cloisters of a Worcestershire priory became part of a broader intellectual river. But this was not a one-way flow. Monasteries continued to absorb knowledge from the outside. Visiting physicians brought books of Arabic medicine translated into Latin and rich with new theories of the humors, of diagnosis, of surgery. While monks rarely performed incisions or amputations, they eagerly recorded procedures. Aelred's successors began annotating their medical texts with these new insights, occasionally correcting their predecessors. This wasn't heretical, it was reverent. Improvement was a form of stewardship. The fall of the monastic infirmary. By the 14th century, the golden age of the monastic infirmary was beginning to fade. The Black Death devastated English monasteries, claiming the lives of thousands of monks and obliterating many infirmaries' delicate routines. Worcester was not spared. In 1349, over half the priory's residents perished within weeks. Records from that time speak of mass graves, overburdened infirmaries, and empty scriptoriums. The careful order that Aelred once imposed gave way to chaos. Even the leeches once so carefully maintained were abandoned. One chronicler noted that the leech jars were left to dry like dead bees in a broken hive. Yet amid the loss, something remarkable happened. Laypeople, denied access to overrun monasteries, began forming their own networks of care. Midwives, herbalists, and barber surgeons filled the void. And what did they use? Recipes from monastic books. Hand-copied leaflets, medical guides, and translated herbals filtered into cities and villages. The knowledge seeded by men like Aelred began to democratize. By the time of the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s under Henry VIII, most monastic infirmaries were destroyed or repurposed. Libraries were plundered. Books were burned, stolen, or hidden. At Worcester, only fragments of the medical texts survived, tucked into private collections or passed down quietly among herbalists. Still, even amid destruction, the echoes of Aelred's work persisted. His slow, meticulous methods, herb gathering, bloodletting schedules, recipe refinement, routine-based healing had taken root too deeply to vanish. Even now, some folk remedies in rural England preserve faint traces of monastic wisdom. A poultice of warm bread and vinegar for wounds, chamomile for stomach pain, feverfew for headaches. These aren't just old wives' tales, they're whispers from infirmary walls, generations removed. Legacy in silence. So what do we make of the leech keepers, the theriac stirrers, the monkish recorders of vomit and pulse and dreams? They weren't scientists in the modern sense. They were not always right. Many of their beliefs, astrological bleeding schedules, the balance of yellow bile, have long been debunked. But their practice of paying attention, of building a structured healing environment, and of respecting the body's rhythms carries enduring value. Modern medicine often moves quickly. Tests, prescriptions, outcomes. But in the infirmaries of medieval England, healing was slow. It was observation, pattern, patience. And in this slowness, we find an early kind of science, not empirical in the modern sense, but systematic nonetheless. Brother Aelred likely never imagined his work would be discussed centuries later. He died a monk among monks, his hands stained with theriac resin, his rooms filled with jars and scrolls. He healed because it was his duty, his craft, and his path to salvation. But through his work, and that of countless anonymous monks like him, generations found care, order, and hope. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the monastic infirmary is not in what it cured, but in how it cared. What then might we recover today from these forgotten halls of quiet medicine? Story 2. How burned flesh became a cure. The iron bar glowed orange in the low firelight, its heat warping the air around it. A shallow brass dish nearby shimmered with sheep fat and powdered rosemary, prepared not for nourishment, but for something far more unsettling cautery. You sit now in the small back chamber of a 13th century healing hut in rural Burgundy, France. The smell is acrid burned herbs, scorched hair, and something sharper beneath. It is not the odor of infection, but the smell of its cure, or so they believed. To understand cauterization as it existed in the medieval world is to step into a realm where medicine, pain, and faith were interwoven without apology. It was not merely a treatment of last resort, it was often the first line of defense against an invisible army of diseases that had no name, only symptoms. Bad blood, pustule plague, or simply a heat in the limb. Cautery, the application of heat to the body to burn tissue, served many purposes. It was used to stop bleeding, to treat infected wounds, to remove growths, and perhaps most surprisingly, to rebalance the body's humors. The theory, as inherited from Galenic medicine, was that burning could draw out or redirect excess humors, particularly black bile and phlegm. In this particular village hut, nestled behind a parish church, a local healer named Almodes of Listen works methodically. She is neither midwife nor nun, but a charlatana, a licensed lay healer, unusual for her time. Her instruments are crude by modern standards: iron rods of different lengths, stored in a clay pot beside the hearth, a horn cup for bloodletting, and a folded linen roll containing salves for post-burn treatment. Her most prized tool, however, is knowledge, passed from her grandmother and reinforced by rare exposure to monastic medical texts. Almodes understands not only how to burn, but when, where, and with what intent. When a man arrives with a festering abscess on his thigh, Almodes does not rush to drain it. Instead, she listens first to the wound's sound as it is pressed, then to the man's recounting of dreams, diet, and seasonal exposure. She determines that this is a cold wound, too much phlegm requiring a hot remedy. The cautery iron is placed in the fire until it glows, then removed with tongs and quickly touched to the skin once briefly. The man screams, his body jerking, but Almodes's hands are firm. A second touch. Then a salve of ash, rosemary, and goat tallow is applied. A linen wrap, a prayer. This was healing by fire. Brutal, unflinching, and rooted in a worldview where bodily suffering was both punishment and path to redemption. But why was cautery so common? And why did people allow it, even request it? The answer lies in both medicine and theology. In a world where illness was believed to stem from internal imbalance and divine displeasure, pain was not something to be avoided, it was something to be endured, even embraced. Burning the flesh served both physical and spiritual functions. It destroyed corruption and allowed the patient to participate in their own purification. For many, the searing pain was a kind of holy trial. Hospitals, especially those run by religious orders, often employed cautery. The Knights Hospitaller, for instance, used red-hot irons in their infirmaries in Jerusalem during the Crusades. When a limb was infected or rotting, cautery could delay amputation or prevent death. Contemporary sources speak of soldiers burned on the battlefield, cauterized with sword tips, not for punishment but preservation. The practice also extended to neurological disorders. In cases of seizures or madness, cautery was applied behind the ears or at the base of the skull, based on the theory that humors could be redirected or purged through the skin. These counterirritants were believed to drive disease outward and away from the organs. Women, too, were treated by cautery particularly for what was broadly termed womb suffocation or hysteria. Heated metal applied to the lower abdomen or thighs was thought to awaken the womb and balance internal heat. Midwives sometimes used gentler versions, heated stones or warmed herbs to avoid excessive damage, but the principle remained the same. Not all practitioners agreed on the method. There was debate over dry versus wet cautery. Dry cautery used heated metal. Wet cautery involved caustic substances, alkaline pastes, or powdered lime. The latter, while less dramatic, caused slow and painful tissue destruction over days. Some saw it as more merciful. Others called it cowardice. And yet, for all its agony, cautery was sometimes astonishingly effective. In an age without antibiotics, when wounds easily turned septic, burning away infected tissue could mean the difference between life and death. It was a crude form of debridement. The pain, while immense, was fleeting compared to the creeping death of untreated gangrene. Monks, too, performed cautery, though only those with medical training. At Monte Cassino in Italy, a famed Benedictine monastery, records describe the use of heated bronze rods to treat migraines by touching the temples. Patients often fainted, but some recovered. In many cases, the burned area was left uncovered to breathe and scab naturally. In others, it was packed with honey or wine-soaked cloth to prevent flies and reduce infection. The scent of healing was unmistakable: charred flesh, damp wool, stale wine, rosemary. But not all cautery was done for illness. There were ritualistic forms, such as those practiced by certain desert monastics in the Levant, who burned small marks into their flesh to symbolize spiritual trials. These were not treatments, but offerings, an imitation of martyrdom in a world obsessed with holiness through suffering. We must not forget the psychological element. Cautery gave the illusion of control. In an age of constant uncertainty, crop failure, war, plague, a person could submit to a healer and be seen, touched, treated. The burn, paradoxically, was a relief, a visible mark of intervention. And so the red iron returned to its fire, again and again. Almodes of Listen, though fictionalized here to reflect many real records, is emblematic of a larger truth. The world of medieval medicine was not uniform. Cautery was not wielded only by learned monks in distant abbeys. It was practiced by women, by travelers, by battle surgeons, and even on rare occasion by the afflicted themselves. One peasant record describes a man who, believing he had been cursed with hot liver, heated a cooking knife and touched it to his ribs until he passed out. He survived barely, but swore the pain had driven the devil out. Cautery became more than a medical practice. It became a metaphor for survival, for endurance, and for the peculiar strength of people who had little else to rely on but heat, herbs, and hope. But how did this controversial treatment persist into later centuries, even as surgery and anatomy began to evolve? What role did cautery play in the broader transformation of medieval into Renaissance medicine? We rejoin our story in the late 14th century, as Europe began stirring beneath the weight of change. Cautery, that ancient and brutal therapy, remained central to medicine, but now it began to evolve, transformed by shifting philosophies, battlefield innovations, and the first flickers of what would become empirical science. Let us begin in the blood-soaked chaos of the 100 Years' War. Surgeons on the battlefield faced grievous wounds, deep lacerations from swords, crushing injuries from maces, and devastating punctures from arrows. In such conditions, cautery was not a considered treatment, it was a necessity. Wounds too severe to stitch or too infected to leave untouched were burned shut. It was the only way to halt bleeding and forestall gangrene. Surgical manuals from the time, such as those attributed to Guy de Chauliac, the renowned French physician, describe in detail the procedure of cauterization during field amputations. Heated irons, sometimes shaped to conform to the limb, were pressed directly to the stump. Chauliac, though a proponent of surgery and learned in the ancient Greek and Arab medical traditions, did not reject cautery as primitive. Instead, he systematized it. In his Chirurgia Magna, written around 1363, he distinguished between different types of cautery: actual cautery, using heat, and potential cautery, using caustic chemicals like lye or verdigris. His text explained where, how deep, and how long to apply the iron. He even advised using aromatics during the procedure to help mask the odor of burning flesh and calm the patient's mind. But there was a deeper shift at work. For centuries, cautery had been explained through the humoral theory, the idea that burning drew out excess blood or bile, rebalancing the body. Now, physicians like Chauliac began linking it more to structural causes: infection, broken vessels, rot. The justification remained partly symbolic, but anatomy was beginning to take root as a valid framework for treatment. This transition was slow and uneven. Most practitioners still lacked formal training. Barbersurgeons, distinct from university-trained physicians, were often the ones wielding the hot iron. In cities, they worked from narrow shops, hanging bowls of leeches in their windows and sharpening their irons next to razors. They were practical men, not theorists. They cauterized because it worked, or at least because it did something visible. In the universities, meanwhile, cautery took on new meaning. The rise of medical education brought increased access to translated texts from Arabic sources like Avicenna's Canon of Medicine and al-Zahrawi's Kitab al-Tasrif. These works detailed surgical techniques with astonishing precision, and they did not shy away from cautery. Al-Zahrawi, in particular, emphasized the use of specialized irons for different parts of the body: rounded tips for internal wounds, flat irons for surface bleeding, and even delicate cauteries for dental work. Dentistry, in fact, is one of the more unexpected areas where cautery thrived. When a tooth abscessed and swelled the jaw, some medieval surgeons drilled a small hole in the gum and inserted a red-hot wire to release pus and seal the wound in a single motion. The pain was horrific, but the alternative was death by infection. The procedure was sometimes accompanied by a short prayer to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches. Yet not everyone submitted to cautery willingly. As medicine slowly moved from religious ritual toward observation and testing, resistance to cautery grew. In parts of southern Italy and Iberia, midwives and herbalists began experimenting with antiseptic herbs and mild astringents: sage, chamomile, and rue, offering alternatives to burning. These treatments were less dramatic, but gentler, and often more acceptable to women and children. At the same time, religious attitudes were changing. The late medieval church began to question whether suffering itself should always be part of healing. Some bishops condemned cautery when used excessively, especially by untrained hands. Others defended it as a reflection of Christ's passion, his own wounds mirrored in the flesh of the suffering. This theological tension is most visible in the writings of Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century mystic whose medical advice remained influential for centuries. She warned against overbearing fire and emphasized harmony with nature. She suggested that burns should only be used when all other methods had failed. In her world, health was a matter of divine balance, not domination by pain. And still, cautery endured. It persisted not just in hospitals and monasteries, but in domestic spaces. Households in Northern Europe kept simple cautery tools, often just iron pokers or spoons, which were heated in cooking fires. Mothers used them on infected cuts or to close bleeding from minor injuries. The act was terrifying, but often performed without ceremony, just another part of daily survival. Stories from the period tell of women burning their own thighs to stop heavy post-childbirth bleeding, or of farmers treating foot rot in animals and then using the same method on themselves. This was a world without anesthesia, where the line between agony and healing was razor thin. But even as cautery remained common, cracks began to appear in its supremacy. The rediscovery of ancient Greek anatomy, especially through dissections carried out in Italian universities like Bologna and Padua, shifted medical understanding toward physical structure. Physicians began to grasp the mechanics of circulation, though incomplete. With this came new surgical techniques, ligature of blood vessels, use of clamps, and sterile dressings. In 1543, Andreas Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, a detailed anatomy book based on human dissection. Though not directly focused on cautery, it challenged Galenic assumptions, pushing medicine further from mystical explanations. By the late 16th century, cautery began to lose its symbolic power. It was no longer invoked as a tool to rebalance the soul. It became a technique painful but practical. The irons were now refined into specific shapes. Some were flat, others rounded. Some had vents to allow steam to escape. Handles were extended to keep the surgeon's hands away from the heat. A few physicians began to advocate pretreatment with alcohol or herbal sedatives. Mandrake root, henbane, and opium mixtures were sometimes used, though their dosing was poorly understood and often dangerous. Still, the pain of cautery remained a constant reminder of its medieval origin. Its persistence wasn't due to cruelty, it was due to lack of options. Infections killed quickly. Bleeding was hard to control. In this landscape, the glowing iron, wielded with skill, gave the illusion of mastery. And so, through religious ritual, battlefield necessity, and household desperation, cautery remained a thread that bound medieval and early modern medicine. But what finally caused the decline of this ancient practice? Was it scientific progress, or something else entirely? By the dawn of the 17th century, the red-hot iron that once symbolized healing, penance, and control over the body had begun to cool. The decline of cautery was not marked by a sudden rejection, nor did it vanish overnight. Instead, it faded slowly, displaced by the twin revolutions of anatomical science and surgical technique. Still, for centuries more, it would flicker in the corners of hospitals, battlefields, and rural kitchens until even its symbolic power burned out. The gentle knife replaces the hot iron. One of the key forces behind cautery's decline was the growing understanding of human anatomy, paired with an emphasis on precision. Where once physicians had cauterized in broad strokes, burning to seal, to purge, to drive out invisible humors, surgeons now began to cut with purpose. In the mid-1500s, French military surgeon Ambroise Paré led a quiet revolution. During the siege of Turin in 1536, Paré, then still young and inexperienced, ran out of boiling oil, the standard treatment for gunshot wounds. Desperate, he turned to a simple balm of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine. To his astonishment, the patients treated with the balm healed better and suffered far less than those who had been burned. Paré's subsequent writings became foundational for modern surgery. He rejected cautery for most wounds, arguing instead for ligatures to tie off blood vessels, antiseptics to clean injuries, and gentler post-operative care. His philosophy was deeply humanist, rooted not only in anatomy but compassion. "I dressed the wound," he wrote, "God healed it." This shift signaled something new, the idea that pain was not always necessary for healing. Cautery was still used for stopping hemorrhage, especially during amputations, but increasingly it became a tool of last resort, not first intention. Where once the smell of scorched skin had defined surgical rooms, now linen bandages, tourniquets, and sutures began to dominate. A new age of infection control. The eventual discovery of blood circulation by William Harvey in 1628, followed by advances in microbiology in the 19th century, rendered cautery obsolete in most contexts. Once bacteria, not imbalance or spiritual corruption, were identified as the cause of infection, Burning the skin seemed not curative, but clumsy. Cautery had always worked best as a blunt tool, effective when no one understood infection, but crude when antiseptics like carbolic acid entered medical practice. Joseph Lister's work on sterilization in the 1860s made it possible to operate without the same fear of infection. With antiseptic sprays, clean gloves, and sterilized scalpels, the old red iron remedy looked increasingly medieval. The final blow came with the invention of anesthesia. With ether 1846 and chloroform 1847, doctors could finally perform surgeries without the terror and trauma of conscious pain. This opened the door to delicate procedures that required precision, not brutality. Where cautery once substituted for speed, now surgeons had time to operate with care. The red-hot iron, once synonymous with life-saving intervention, became a relic, lingering echoes in culture and practice. Yet even as cautery disappeared from most medical rooms, its imprint remained. In language, the word cauterize took on metaphorical meaning. It now describes the act of sealing, purging, or removing something deeply destructive and infection in the body, yes, but also in the mind or soul. We speak of cauterizing memory, cauterizing a wound in the nation, or burning away the past. In military medicine, a modern descendant survives: electrocautery. This practice, used even today, employs electric current to seal bleeding vessels during surgery. It is precise, controlled, and sterile, but conceptually rooted in its medieval ancestor. No longer does it rely on fire and brute heat, but the idea remains the same: destruction for the sake of healing. Modern-day cautery is also found in dermatology, where it's used to remove warts, seal off minor bleeding, or excise small lesions. The tools are sleek, pen-shaped, and humming quietly, not glowing red, but their lineage is clear. Even in emergency wilderness medicine, the principle lingers. When no proper tools are available and bleeding cannot be stopped, some survival manuals still mention cauterization as a dire, last option. It is the end of the road when every other method has failed. Much like it was in 12th century Burgundy, where almodes of Lisson reached for the iron with trembling but resolute hands. The faith that burned beneath the skin. The end of cautery also marked a broader shift in medical thinking, from symbolic to scientific, from suffering to comfort. Medieval patients endured cautery not because they were unaware of the pain, but because they believed in its meaning. To be burned was to be cleansed. To survive, it was to be proven worthy. Healing, in many cases, was indistinguishable from penance. This belief was not wholly eradicated with the rise of science. Vestiges of it survive in the modern world, in our acceptance of painful therapies, our admiration for endurance, and our language around healing as trial or purification. Even today, many chronic illnesses are described using metaphors of battle and fire. We fight disease. We burn out infection. We sear the site of a tumor with radiation. We speak as though healing must be earned through struggle. What cautery teaches us, across centuries, is that healing has always involved meaning, not just biology. Whether through red-hot iron or microscopic science, the body must be understood within the story it lives. Closing the wound. The cauterist, once a common figure, has now vanished. Her iron tools are cold, her fire long extinguished. But her place in history remains secure, not as a figure of cruelty, but of necessity. Almodes of Lisson, like thousands of others across medieval Europe, stood between infection and death with only fire in her hands. She was feared, respected, and often misunderstood. Her work left scars but also saved lives. In an age without light, she brought flame. So when we think of medieval medicine, let us not merely recoil at the pain of cautery. Let us consider the courage it took to offer it and to endure it. Let us remember the burn not just as agony, but as action. A moment where healing meant fire and survival was measured in scars. And finally, let us ask, In a world of dazzling technology and painless cures, do we still recognize the value of what was endured in the dark for the sake of life? Story 3. The Surgeon's Apprentice, a day in the life of a barber surgeon. You awaken before the sun, not in a bed, but on a sack of straw in the rear alcove of a shop tucked into a bustling alleyway in 14th century London. The room smells sharply of iron, vinegar, old blood, and sweat. A cat brushes past your foot. You are the apprentice to a barber surgeon, and today is your first day. Outside, the city yawns awake. Hooves echo on cobblestones, bakers' fire ovens. But inside this narrow space, a different kind of work begins. A leather apron is thrust into your hands, still crusted with yesterday's stains. Your master, a thick-fingered man named Willem Stoor, is already heating water and sharpening razors. Barber surgeons were not university-trained doctors. They were craftsmen, licensed by guilds and city authorities, and known for combining cosmetic grooming with grisly manual medicine. Haircutters, beard trimmers, tooth pullers, bleeders, and bone setters all in one. In a time when the educated physician might never touch a patient, the barber surgeon did the touching, cutting, and cleaning. The iconic red and white striped barber pole. That comes later, but its origin is here in the blood-stained cloths hung outside shops to dry, wrapped around the poles where leeches were once kept. A shop of many services. You take a moment to look around. The front of the shop contains the familiar tools of a barber: combs carved from horn, razors with steel blades, and a wide-backed wooden chair. But hanging on the wall just beyond are more ominous items: curved knives, saws of various lengths, bloodletting bowls marked with measurement lines, and small boxes filled with powders, mustard seed, saltpeter, orris root, and dried beetles. On one shelf sit several glass jars. You glance inside. One contains what looks like dried herbs, another cloudy liquid, the third is moving, leeches, fat, black, pooling slowly. You will learn to handle them soon. By trade and by city law, your master performs several medical tasks: bloodletting, lancing boils, setting fractures, pulling teeth, cleaning wounds, treating ulcers, and even castrating animals. Some barber surgeons operated on humans with kidney stones or bladder issues, but that required special licenses and city approval. The apprenticeship is strict. You live with your master, assist in every task, and learn by doing. There are no medical books here, only oral instruction and muscle memory. Your first duty: cleaning the razors and boiling the bandages. The morning patients. Before long, the first patient arrives, a farmer with a swollen, pus-filled lump on his shoulder. A carbuncle, likely. Willem glances at it, grunts, and gestures for you to hold the man's arms. The procedure is quick. He heats a small blade over the fire, then makes a swift incision. Yellow-white pus oozes out. The man moans but does not move. You hand over clean linen, and Willem presses it firmly against the wound. He sprinkles powdered yarrow and applies a vinegar-soaked bandage. The farmer pays with 2 silver coins and a cabbage, then limps out. Next comes a young woman with tooth pain. One molar is black and loose. Willem instructs you to fetch the pelican, a metal instrument resembling a curved beak. You watch as he inserts it into the woman's mouth, braces her head against the chair, and with a practiced jerk pulls. The scream is short but sharp. The tooth comes free, blood pooling on her tongue. The work is unrelenting, physical, and messy. There is no illusion of sterile space, though Willem keeps his instruments reasonably clean. The philosophy is simple: the faster the procedure, the better the outcome. Your role for now is humble assist, hold, clean, and observe. But already you are absorbing patterns: which patients flinch, which wounds smell like death, how to read someone's pain from their eyes before they speak. Lunch among the bleeders. At midday, the shop closes briefly. Willem opens a small flask of ale and tears bread with his teeth. You sit beside him on a barrel. "You'll bleed someone this week," he says without looking at you. "Just arms to start." Bloodletting was one of the barber surgeon's most frequent tasks. The idea, inherited from ancient Galen and popularized in medieval medicine, was that the body held four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was an imbalance. Bleeding removed excess, especially blood. City ordinances often required that barbers perform regular bloodlettings on monks and noblemen. The timing was based on lunar phases and astrology. Charts were kept to determine when the veins of the arm, foot, or forehead were best opened. You're told to learn the median cubital vein located at the bend of the elbow. Big, easy to see, but don't go too deep, Willem warns. You strike an artery and they don't get up. For this task, the phlegm is used, a flat, triangular blade that looks more like a tool for gutting fish than healing humans. A quick jab, a bowl beneath, and out flows life. One barber surgeon in Norwich reportedly bled over 200 patients in a single Lent season. The frequency was not questioned. It was routine, just as we might take vitamins today. But not all patients come for such ordered reasons. The unexpected visitor. Later in the afternoon, a city watchman bursts into the shop, blood soaking through his jerkin. A blade wound, likely from a tavern brawl. Willem doesn't speak, he just moves. You scramble to fetch clean linen, vinegar, and the curved needle. The wound is deep but not fatal. Willem pours wine into it, presses cloth hard, then begins stitching. He uses black silk thread, treated with beeswax. The man grits his teeth but does not cry out. When it's done, Willem applies a salve of crushed comfrey and lard. The man leaves 10 minutes later, arm stiff, debt unpaid. City'll pay, he mutters. You clean the blood off the chair. By evening, you are exhausted. Your hands smell of metal and bile. You eat cold beans and fall asleep in your clothes. The day was long, but tomorrow will be longer. In time, you will learn to lance, to bleed, to suture. You will take on your own patients. Perhaps, if fortune favors you, you will one day join the company of barber surgeons, a guild of professionals granted authority by the crown itself. But as you drift into sleep, one thought lingers. How did barber surgeons like Willem come to hold such power over the human body? When university doctors would not touch a patient, why were men with razors trusted to cut, to burn, and to heal? And how did the rise of this bloody profession help lay the foundation for modern surgery itself? By the late 14th century, the barber surgeon was no longer merely a man with a sharp blade and a steady hand. He was becoming something more: a professional, a recognized figure in an increasingly organized and regulated world of pre-modern medicine. But this transformation didn't happen overnight. It was forged slowly, blade by blade, stitch by stitch, through guild rules, royal decrees, and the daily pain of practical experience. The young apprentice perhaps still you now sees not only the chaos and clatter of the shop, but the structure emerging beneath it. And today, you will step out from the shop's shadow into that world. The guild's gentle grip. In cities like London, Paris, and Cologne, barber surgeons were required to join formal organizations, guilds, or confraternities that regulated practice. These guilds didn't just protect the trade, they enforced standards. In England, the Barbers' Company was granted official status as early as the 13th century, and by the 14th century, it had clear regulations on apprenticeships, inspections, and professional conduct. Your master, Willem Stoor, is a member in good standing. That means he can take apprentices, display his brass basin sign, and charge for surgical services. But it also means he must pay dues, attend annual gatherings, and accept periodic inspections by city officials or guild elders. This morning, the shop is cleaner than usual. Instruments laid out on oiled cloths, the floor swept. A small pewter cup filled with warm water for hand washing, rare but necessary today. An inspector is coming. He arrives mid-morning wearing a woolen tabard bearing the guild sigil, a razor crossed with a lancet surrounded by a red ring of blood. He asks questions not of you but of Willem. When was the last bleeding performed? How many patients this week? Is your apprentice progressing? He checks your tools, notes the condition of the leeches, and asks to see your patient register. It's just a cloth scroll, inked with names, dates, and treatments. Sparse notes, but enough to track repeat customers. The inspector nods. He leaves a wax seal stamped on the doorframe. You're in good standing. This inspection isn't just ceremonial. It reflects a growing movement in medieval Europe, the professionalization of medical trades. The days of wandering healers and unchecked cutters were slowly giving way to regulated practice. But this regulation didn't necessarily elevate the barber surgeon's status, not yet. Instead, it aimed to control the chaos, to protect patients from charlatans and cities from scandal. The long divide, surgeons versus physicians. Even as barber surgeons gained recognition, they remained socially and intellectually separate from physicians. Physicians were university educated, spoke Latin, and studied ancient texts. They diagnosed, prognosticated, and rarely soiled their hands. They wore long robes and carried books. Their authority came from scholarship. Barber surgeons, on the other hand, were artisans. They cut. They did not debate theory or consult horoscopes, though they might occasionally reference the moon's position before a bleeding. Their knowledge came from practiced centuries of passed-down technique, observation, and adaptation. Yet the gap between these groups was slowly narrowing. In 1368, the French King Charles V created the College of Surgery, formally recognizing surgeons as distinct from mere barbers. To become a member, one needed to pass examinations, submit casework, and prove skill. Still, in practice, most surgeons remained connected to the barbering trade, cutting hair in the morning, lancing abscesses by noon. The guilds reflected this dual identity. In England, the Company of Barbers and Surgeons would not formally unite until 1540 under Henry VIII, but even centuries earlier, their daily work was intertwined. One might say the barbers brought the razors, and the surgeons brought the theory. As an apprentice, you begin to see the complexity. Your training now includes more than technique. Willem teaches you the names of the bones, the location of key veins, and how to detect when a wound is bad blood or corruption. You learn to recognize signs of infection not in modern terms, but by smell, color, and texture. You practice bloodletting on a pig, then a goat. Finally, one afternoon, Willem tells you to prepare the phlegm. A pale merchant slumps in the chair. Willem stands behind you, arms crossed. Find the vein. Don't hesitate. You do. The blood is dark and flows freely. The merchant sighs in relief, as if the pressure inside him has been released. You have begun. Knowledge on the edge of the knife. Barber surgeons were not without education. They kept reference texts, illustrated herbals, surgical handbooks, and sometimes even Latin anatomical diagrams copied from monastic libraries. One such book, Chirurgia, circulated widely in England and France. It included detailed woodcuts showing how to bandage wounds, set bones, and even treat battlefield injuries. Though basic, these texts reinforced consistent practices across regions. Barber surgeons shared knowledge freely through letters, conversations in guild halls, and even traveling exhibitions. Some would demonstrate techniques at markets or fairs, pulling teeth before a crowd, or performing minor procedures in public to advertise their skills. You accompany Willem to one such fair. He treats a farmer's infected hand, slicing open a boil while children watch wide-eyed. He explains the procedure as he works, his voice calm, his hands practiced. Later in the tavern, he compares notes with a fellow barber from York. They discuss the use of pig fat versus lard in salves. The conversation is practical, but also scientific, if only in its own grounded way. This is the edge of medical transformation. Theory and practice, book and blade, beginning to intertwine. Surgery's growing respectability. By the 15th century, surgery was gaining respect. Barber surgeons were called upon not only in towns, but by armies, guilds, even royal courts. Monarchs had their personal barber surgeons, men trusted not just to cut their beards, but to lance abscesses and treat wounds. The tools improved, too. Scalpels, forceps, probes, and clamps became more refined. Iron instruments gave way to better steel. Some barber surgeons even experimented with early forms of anesthesia, opium poppy mixed with wine, or sponge-soaked concoctions placed over the nose. Still, pain was unavoidable. Part of your training includes how to calm a patient, where to place your knee during a tooth pull, how to brace a shoulder during a bleeding, when to whisper a prayer, and when to shout. Pain management was not just physical, it was psychological. A steady voice, a firm grip, a confident cut, these were as essential as any blade. The barber surgeon was, in this way, both technician and performer. But the question remains. In a world shifting toward university medicine, where learned men in robes debate the properties of bile, what place would remain for men like Willem and for apprentices like you? Would the future of surgery belong to the hands of craftsmen or the minds of scholars? The years pass. The shop smells the same iron, old blood, and lye, but your hands no longer tremble when holding a blade. Your apprenticeship has ended. You are now a full barber surgeon, a tradesman of flesh and blood. The transition was not marked by robes or degrees, but by experience and pain, yours and others. Still, something has changed. You no longer work solely by feel. Your treatments are faster, cleaner. The wound you stitch today heals faster than the one you treated 2 years ago. Your instruments are sharper and your judgment keener. You know when to cut and when not to. But beyond your shop walls, the world is also changing. The birth of surgical specialization. By the early 16th century, barber surgery was beginning to fracture into two worlds. One remained practical, local, and deeply embedded in working-class life. It was the barber shop where minor surgery, bleeding, and grooming coexisted. This was where your shop still belongs. The other was emerging among scholars and battlefield surgeons, men who called themselves simply surgeons, abandoning the barber title. These surgeons sought formal recognition. They published books, performed dissections, and argued for surgery's legitimacy as a learned profession. In 1540, a monumental shift occurred in England. King Henry VIII merged the Company of Barbers with the Guild of Surgeons, creating the Company of Barber Surgeons. This merger officially recognized both trades under a single institutional body. It was a political and professional compromise. Barbers could continue performing minor procedures, but more advanced surgeries were restricted to those who could prove their knowledge. You remember the day the new seal arrived in your borough, the king's stamp upon your trade. You felt pride, but also unease. Rules were multiplying. Examinations were now required for more complex procedures. Licenses were harder to come by. A divide was widening between men of the shop and men of the chamber. The writing was on the wall. Surgery became the science. As the Renaissance matured, medicine became increasingly focused on internal anatomy. Dissection, once taboo, now served as the bedrock of surgical education. Anatomists like Andreas Vesalius dissected corpses publicly, teaching from the body rather than the book. His De Humani Corporis Fabrica became the new scripture of flesh. And with each new discovery, the scope of surgery expanded and left the barber behind. Operations that once required cautery or crude amputation could now be refined. Bladders were drained through catheterization. Hernias could be reduced. Cataracts once left to fester could be couched with specialized needles. Barbers, with their small shops and limited tools, were unprepared for this new world. You, as a barber surgeon of the old school, could not compete with men operating in anatomy theaters or studying under university masters. Still, your place remained vital to the everyday lives of most people. Rural folk still came to you with boils, bad teeth, infected cuts, and broken ribs. Soldiers returning from war brought wounds that needed cleaning. You bandaged more than a few heads during outbreaks of tavern brawling. The nobility may have hired surgeons, the poor still came to the barber. But the tide was turning. The end of an era. By the 18th century, the distinction between barber and surgeon became formalized. In 1745, in Britain, the Company of Barber Surgeons split permanently. Surgeons established the Company of Surgeons, which later evolved into the Royal College of Surgeons. This division severed the shared identity that had lasted for centuries. From that point forward, surgery belonged to the educated. Barbering returned to its roots: haircuts, grooming, and basic hygiene. The old image of the multitasking tradesman, the man who could shave your beard, drain your blood, and pull your tooth in one sitting, was fading. And yet, even in this separation, traces of the old barber surgeon survived. The red and white pole remains, a symbol of blood and bandages. The use of the word barber persisted in military ranks and ships for decades. Surgeon's mate became a common naval posting, often filled by men trained not in universities, but through apprenticeship. And even today, the phrase "cutting edge in medicine" harks back to those early blades held not by scholars, but by barbers. What they left behind. The barber surgeons, though lacking formal education, were pioneers of hands-on healing. They recorded procedures, shared knowledge across borders, and treated people who could never afford a physician. They democratized care. They brought surgical practice down to earth, sometimes literally, operating in open markets and roadside camps. Many innovations came from their experience. They standardized bloodletting procedures and made them routine. They developed early wound cleaning techniques, using wine, vinegar, and herbs. They improved surgical instruments based on feedback from daily use, not distant theory. They introduced the concept of mobile medicine, going where the wounded were, rather than waiting in fixed institutions. And most importantly, they formed the bridge between medieval mysticism and modern medical rationalism. Without their gritty, imperfect contributions, surgery might have remained a distant, elite theory rather than a practical discipline. You, as one of them, were not just a servant of the blade. You were a maker of the future. Reflection in the razor's edge. Now, in the quiet hours of the evening, you sit by the fire, whetstone in hand. You no longer see your tools as crude. They are honest, worn smooth by years of service. The chair where you've seated hundreds of patients still creaks the same way. The razor gleams in the firelight. You still know the weight of a bleeding bowl, the smell of a healing wound, the silence of a patient enduring the prick of a needle or the pop of a pulled tooth. You have walked the line between blood and respect, between craft and science. And though history may forget your name, it cannot forget your work. The next time a surgeon dons gloves in a sterile room, selects a precision scalpel, and begins to cut, they will, whether they know it or not, carry a piece of your legacy. Because before the scalpel was sacred, it was ordinary. Before surgery was sterile, it was personal. Before it was professional, it was practiced by hands like yours. So one might wonder, in all our progress, what have we gained and what have we lost by closing the barber surgeon's shop? Story 4. Pigeon Therapy and Other Remedies for the Plague. The year is 1348. The streets are quiet not from rest but from fear. You live in a town outside Florence. Once humming with the gossip of merchants and the rhythm of market carts, it now echoes with nothing but wind and the occasional creak of a shutter swinging loose. The plague has arrived. People call it many names: the pestilence, the great mortality, the Black Death. You simply call it the breath of God, for it kills swiftly, sometimes within a day. Boils rise beneath the arms or in the groin, black as pitch. Fevers burn the body from the inside. Some bleed from the nose. Others slip into unconsciousness and never wake again. You have not yet fallen ill, but you've seen enough to understand that it's coming. A world desperate for cures. The learned physicians are gone, some fled, others died. What remains is a patchwork of remedies improvised, inherited, imagined. There is no single cure, no guiding hand, just fear and hope twisted together. In the town square, a man in a leather hood preaches repentance, beating himself with cords. "It is our sin that burns us," he cries. "Purge the soul and the body will follow." He speaks for the flagellants, groups who believe self-punishment can spare them from divine wrath. People gather, watch, and weep. Some join in, others simply leave. But you seek a more earthly solution. You've heard of a woman, a midwife named Giulia, who still sees the sick. Her home is on the edge of the town, and it smells strongly of camphor, vinegar, and thyme. You knock and she opens, gloved, masked, cautious. She will help, but only if you follow her rules. The first thing she tells you is this: if the swelling comes, place a live pigeon on it. You blink but say nothing. She explains, the warmth and oils from the bird's body may draw out the poison. The life of the pigeon may somehow absorb the sickness. It is, she admits, not always successful, but better than nothing. You leave with instructions. Catch or purchase a pigeon, young and alive. Place its breast directly on the bubo, the swollen lymph node. Hold it in place until the bird dies. Repeat with a second pigeon if possible. The logic of desperation. It sounds absurd, but the use of animals in healing was not uncommon. The pigeon's warm body was thought to attract the poisonous vapors rising from within the flesh. Some healers slit the bird's belly first. Others placed garlic between the bird and skin. Still others used frogs, rats, or even small dogs in the same way. There was a desperate kind of logic to it. If the body was poisoned, surely the infection could be drawn out like venom from a wound. Of course, no one understood Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. They didn't know it lived in fleas or that fleas rode rats. Instead, they blamed bad air, the miasma. This theory led to another common remedy: sweet-smelling substances. In Giulia's home, a pouch of dried herbs hangs at the neck. Posy bags, they're called. Lavender, rosemary, cloves, and wormwood. She urges you to wear one. She also tells you to burn vinegar-soaked cloths in your house and to sprinkle rose water along the doorways. It will keep the air pure, she insists. You do as you're told. The balance of the humors. Like others, Giulia relies on the ancient theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, she explains, is imbalance, and the plague is imbalance in its fiercest form. You see this in her treatments. For hot, swollen buboes, she applies cool poultices of clay and vinegar. For chills and weakness, hot cloths and mustard plasters. For vomiting, mint tea or crushed fennel. And always, bleeding small cuts in the arms or legs to release the heat. If the patient survives the fever and the swelling bursts, there is hope, but few make it that far. Sometimes she lances the buboes with a hot needle. Then she applies a mixture of onion, garlic, and lard. It smells foul, but she says it draws out corruption. You help her once. The sight of black pus oozing from the wound stays with you for days. She uses theriac, a thick paste of herbs, honey, and powdered minerals. Originally from Greek and Arabic traditions, it was meant to cure all poisons. It is expensive and increasingly hard to find, but some towns still guard old jars of it, cracked and dusty. Preventative measures, strange but serious. Others in town have adopted peculiar practices to ward off disease. You see people sitting between fires to smoke out the bad air, drinking crushed emerald dissolved in wine, holding loaves of bread under their armpits, then feeding them to dogs, believing the bread absorbs poison, wearing rubies or sapphires against the skin for protection. One man walks the streets with a pomander, a ball filled with perfume held constantly to his nose. He won't remove it, even to eat. Some of these methods have meaning. Aromatics do deter fleas. Vinegar is mildly antibacterial. Even garlic has antibiotic properties. But of course, no one understands any of that yet. They rely on symbols, analogies, patterns drawn from earlier plagues and older wisdom. Giulia's house remains a place of fragile hope. She keeps no tally of deaths, only the living. She does not claim to cure, she simply tries to help. When a child recovers, she says a prayer. When an old man dies, she washes the body herself, quietly and alone. You begin to notice a pattern in survival. Those who live are treated early, are kept clean, are kept cool or warm as needed, are hydrated with barley water and herbal tea, are not abandoned. It occurs to you that these are not remedies in the magical sense. They are acts of care, and sometimes that is enough. The fragile line between hope and folly. But not all treatments are so mild. A traveling doctor enters town claiming he can cure the plague with fire. He offers to cauterize the buboes, literally burn the skin open. A few desperate men submit. You do not watch. The smell carries through the street for hours. Another man peddles a powder made from crushed toads and dried blood. He charges dearly and vanishes by nightfall. Meanwhile, Giulia continues her work. Pigeons, onions, vinegar, and prayer. She is scorned by some, praised by others. When she falls ill herself, there is no one to treat her. You stay by her side, doing as she did for others. She survives barely. By the end of that terrible summer, half the town is gone. The graveyard is full, but you are alive. Giulia is alive, and some small number of those treated with pigeon poultices and herbal compresses live too. It's impossible to say whether the pigeon therapy worked. The birds died, yes. Some patients died anyway. Others survived. But in a world with no understanding of bacteria, no antibiotics, and no vaccine, the pigeon was more than a bird. It was a gesture, a belief, a small, living symbol of the idea that healing was still possible. And so you ask yourself, what made the difference? Was it the vinegar, the onions, the theriac? Or was it something quieter: care, attention, the refusal to abandon the sick? As the town begins to rebuild, and the fires of pestilence smolder to embers, one question remains. If the plague returns, and many believe it will, what will we do differently next time? The plague did not vanish. It receded, only to return. Waves of illness rolled through Europe like a tide of death, each bringing new symptoms, new theories, and new strategies, some grounded in learning, others in sheer desperation. You are older now, perhaps a few years removed from the first great wave. The graveyard is green again, and the carts no longer creak under the weight of the dead. But rumors of a second outbreak spread from the port cities Marseille, Genoa, Bristol. The air grows thick with tension, as much as disease. You know more now. You've watched, helped, and grieved. And yet, as the pestilence returns, you find yourself once again searching for ways to survive. This time, the physicians have returned. The learned return. Clad in long robes and gloved hands, some wear masks with beak-like snouts filled with herbs. These are the plague doctors, a late but iconic development. The beak, packed with camphor, rose petals, and mint, is intended to filter out the miasma or bad air. It does not work, but it lends them a strange authority. They carry long canes not only for pointing, but for prodding bodies from a distance. Some physicians set up treatment houses where patients are isolated and observed. This is new, a structured approach, albeit crude. They track symptoms, take notes, and experiment with combinations of treatments. You begin to notice a difference between folk healers like Giulia and these university-trained men. They speak in Latin. They cite Galen and Avicenna, but their methods are not always more effective. Their preferred treatments include bloodletting, still common, now guided by astrological charts. Bleed during the waning moon, from the basilic vein if the bubo is below the waist. blistering agents such as mustard plasters or cantharides, powdered beetles, to draw out the poison. Enemas believed to purge internal toxins. Recipes include rose oil, vinegar, and milk. Purging powders, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, sometimes with wild hellebore or scammony root. When patients improve, it's attributed to the success of treatment. When they die, their humors were too far gone. Medical texts and Arabic influence. Not all physicians rely on guesswork. Some study texts preserved and translated from Arabic scholars like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Al-Razi, Rhazes. These authors combined Greek theories with empirical observation. Their books list dozens of plague treatments, including fumigating with sandalwood and amber, drinking vinegar and mint syrup, burning a losewood to purify the air. You see some of these methods in practice, especially among wealthier patients who can afford imported ingredients. Interestingly, even these scholars recommend avoidance above all. Isolate, purify the air, avoid crowds. These are some of the few strategies that actually help, though no one fully understands why. When the church prescribes, the church continues to play a central role, both in medicine and meaning. Many believe the plague is a divine punishment. Public penance increases. Processions wind through city streets, sometimes barefoot, sometimes flagellating. Altars are adorned with plague saints. St. Sebastian, pierced with arrows, and St. Roch, who survived the disease with divine help. In some towns, masses for the sick become daily rituals. Bells toll not only for the dead, but as a kind of sonic medicine chasing evil spirits from the air. Monasteries offer both care and containment. Some create isolation wards or pest houses for suspected cases. Monks pray, administer vinegar baths, and recite psalms as they tend the ill. A few even attempt primitive autopsies quietly, in secret. Despite their bravery, entire abbeys are sometimes lost within weeks. You meet a Benedictine monk named Father Anselm, who shares a strange belief that those who do not fear the plague may survive it. Fear invites the demon, he tells you. Peace confuses it. He lights incense in every corner of the cell, sprinkles salt on the threshold, and insists on keeping a white candle burning at all times. You do not know if it helps, but Father Anselm lives. Quarantine and containment. One strategy slowly proves effective: quarantine. The word comes from quaranta giorni, 40 days. In Venice, ships arriving from infected ports are held offshore for 40 days before docking. Goods are fumigated, letters dipped in vinegar, and travelers examined. In cities like Milan, entire houses are bricked up when a case is found, everyone inside, infected or not, left to live or die together. Harsh, but sometimes successful. In your own town, the authorities begin marking doors. Red crosses indicate plague within. Some doors are sealed entirely. Food is delivered to windows. Payment is left in vinegar-filled bowls. These measures are frightening, but strangely effective. You see fewer cases in households that isolate early. The idea of containment, a revolutionary concept, is beginning to take hold. New folk remedies emerge. Giulia is still working. Though older and more cautious, she's added new treatments to her repertoire. A salve of marigold and ash, applied to buboes after lancing. Chewing wormwood, believed to protect the stomach. Burning juniper in the corners of homes. Brewing elderberry wine as both medicine and morale. She scoffs at some physicians but respects others. She says it's not the Latin that matters, but the listening. You help her prepare a treatment based on rumor, placing a split fig over the swelling, then discarding it once it turns black. It's not clear whether it works. Some survive, some don't. But you've noticed that those who receive some treatment, even symbolic, fare better than those abandoned. Touch, presence, routine. These are medicines too. The slow shift. By the end of this second outbreak, The population is thinner still, but the survivors are wiser. People begin to associate plague not with divine punishment alone, but with patterns, where it strikes, when it spreads, how it travels. More physicians stay in cities instead of fleeing. More cities establish bureaus of health to monitor disease. Some even begin keeping written records, early epidemiology, though they wouldn't call it that. Giulia's notes, scribbled in the margins of old calendars, record who lived, who died, and what was tried. They are not scientific, but they are a form of data. And slowly, very slowly, a new kind of medical thinking begins to take shape. But one question remains. If the next plague is different, faster, deadlier, or subtler, will we remember what worked? Or will we start again, from pigeons and prayers? The year is now 1370, though it could just as well be 1420 or even 1665. The plague has returned more times than you can count. Sometimes it's the same black swellings and fiery fevers. Other times it's more subtle, a cough, a weakness, and sudden collapse. The symptoms shift, but the pattern remains: fear, death, and frantic attempts to heal. But this time, something is different. The people who survive are not simply lucky, they are prepared. What began as frantic improvisation has begun to settle into ritual and system. People understand when to isolate, when to fumigate, how to cleanse. Towns build pest houses, simple buildings on the outskirts meant to contain the sick. Villages close roads. Ships are inspected. Records are kept. And in this new world, the remedies of the past, pigeons, garlic, bloodletting, begin to give way to something new. The remnants of belief. That's not to say the old ways vanish overnight. You still see pigeons sold at the edge of town, not as food, but as treatment. Some midwives insist they've seen it work. They describe the way the bird weakens after being pressed to the skin, as if it has taken the poison into itself. And people believe because sometimes people do survive. But more often now, these old treatments are paired with new ones. Vinegar is still used, but now it's boiled into steam and inhaled. Herbs are still burned, but in sealed chambers. Bloodletting continues, but is questioned more frequently, especially when patients die quicker afterward. The idea that illness may come from something invisible, something passed from one body to another, is beginning to take hold. You hear words like contagion and transmission. Some say illness travels through sight, others say through breath. A few whisper of tiny worms in the blood, an idea carried from distant Arabic texts. They are not correct, but they are not entirely wrong either. There is a strange comfort in this, the feeling that knowledge is growing, that experience matters. Giulia, now in her elder years, treats fewer people directly, but her knowledge has been copied, passed from apprentice to apprentice, sometimes even to physicians. Her book of notes, once held together by string, has been bound in leather. You helped her do it. Public health before germs. You've begun to think less like a survivor and more like a recorder. You notice how some neighborhoods are always hit hardest. You notice that people who live near waste pits fall ill more often. You notice that when wells are cleaned and homes aired out, disease spreads more slowly. Others are noticing too. Some cities begin hearing officials, not doctors, but plague wardens, to inspect homes, manage burials, and enforce quarantines. These are not always popular roles. In fact, they are often feared, but they are necessary. The warden keeps a ledger. His job is to track the sick and the dead. In Venice and Milan, health boards are established, early forms of municipal public health. They do not understand bacteria, but they do understand patterns. They observe, regulate, and respond. Even some kings and nobles begin to act more cautiously. Palaces are emptied at the first sign of illness. Court physicians create travel protocols. Caravans are checked. Pest certificates are issued to travelers showing no signs of illness. Slowly, a system is forming, medicine not as magic, but as management. And it's here that the plague, unknowingly, becomes the mother of public health. what remains and what's forgotten. By the 17th century, some of the oldest remedies have all but vanished. Few now place pigeons on buboes, though the stories remain. Vinegar is still used, but more as cleanser than cure. Bloodletting becomes less common with each generation, and physicians, once removed from the body, now examine, dissect, and intervene. Hospitals change. Instead of religious houses of last rites, they become centers of containment and triage. Doctors begin to specialize. Plague doctors are replaced by general practitioners. The beaked masks fade into history, but their image lingers. And yet, even as medicine modernizes, a few practices persist in subtle ways. Herbal fumigation becomes the precursor to air purification. Posy bags evolve into handkerchiefs soaked in menthol or spirits. Quarantine born from desperation becomes law. Record-keeping becomes epidemiology. And pigeons. They remain in stories strange symbols of a time when a bird was believed to hold the power to absorb death. The long memory of the plague. You now keep records, not just of symptoms and treatments, but of outcomes, patterns, failures, what was tried and what was not. You do not call yourself a doctor. You're just someone who saw what worked and what didn't. In time, others will look at your notes and learn. They will find the gaps, the errors, the accidental successes. They will test. They will improve. But without these stories, they would have no place to begin. Even centuries later, in the age of microscopes and vaccines, when the Black Death has receded into history books, people will still ask, how did anyone survive? And the answer will be the same as it was in 1348. They endured, they observed, they tried. Even when it meant placing a bird on a boil, even when it meant lighting rosemary on a fire and hopping it kept death away, even when it meant closing a city gate and turning away friends. There is no romance in plague, only resilience. And as you close your journal, and the world outside breathes a little easier, one final thought remains. When the next great sickness comes, will we remember the lessons left behind by pigeons, plague doctors, and the hands of women who healed without names? Story 5. Urine as Diagnosis, the Art of Uroscopy. The year is 1457, and you're standing in the dimly lit room of a city physician's chambers in Lubeck, part of the Hanseatic League. The room smells faintly of aged parchment, clove, and chamber pots. On the table near the window, bathed in pale morning light, are a dozen glass flasks, each filled with different shades of yellow, brown, red, and even milky white fluid. You're not looking at elixirs or tinctures. You're looking at urine. Because this is the age of uroscopy, the dominant medical diagnostic method in late medieval and early Renaissance Europe. For the better part of 1,000 years, physicians from London to Constantinople trusted the contents of a glass flask of urine more than any physical exam or medical questioning. The bladder was believed to reflect the state of the entire body, and more importantly, the soul. And your role today is not that of a surgeon or herbalist. You're here as a physician's apprentice. And your master, Magister Otto Raben, is a skilled diagnostician trained in Paris, fluent in Latin and Greek, and wholly devoted to the art of the golden liquid. The flask in the chart. Your day begins early, as it always does, by sorting the urine flasks. Each one is sealed with a strip of linen, marked with the patient's name, the time of day the sample was taken, and the person's humoral type: sanguine, choleric, melancholic, or phlegmatic as estimated from their complexion and behavior. On the wall hangs a faded but beautifully illuminated urine wheel, a color chart that displays 20 or more shades of urine, each linked to a different disease, organ, or humoral imbalance. Pale yellow, cold in the stomach, perhaps too much phlegm. Dark brown, heat in the liver or dehydration of the blood. Cloudy with sediment, a flux of humors, possibly kidney stones. Red or rust-colored, corruption of the blood, or more ominously, a fever brought on by divine punishment. Otto holds the flask up to the light and begins his inspection. There is no microscope, no test strip, no temperature gauge. Just his trained eye, his sense of smell, and centuries of inherited theory. He swirls the fluid gently. He checks color, which reveals heat, cold, and disease location. Clarity, which suggests strength or weakness of digestion. Sediment, called the earth of the urine, indicating blockage or aging. Foam, which might signify kidney illness. Smell, which could hint at putrefaction, infection, or even sorcery. A strong, acrid scent might suggest a hot condition. A sweet smell, rare but distinctive, might point to what modern doctors would recognize as diabetes. Otto calls it honey water, and it is never a good sign. He dictates his observations, which you note carefully in the register. Then he speaks the diagnosis aloud. A patient appears. A merchant named Herr Wolfram enters, coughing into a cloth. He does not sit. He simply offers his flask, removed from a pouch and carefully sealed. Otto holds it to the light, then compares it to the wheel. Too pale, he murmurs. His digestion is weak, cold humors. There is vapor in the stomach. You wait. He instructs Wolfram to avoid all cold foods, no cheese, no cucumbers, no wine. Only warm ale, soft bread, and lightly spiced meat. He prescribes a decoction of fennel and caraway to be drunk before bed. No bloodletting, not yet. Otto does not touch the man, nor does he ask for symptoms beyond the color of the sample. His trust lies with the urine, not the voice of the patient. This may seem strange to you, but it is the norm in 15th century medicine. The urine is the true storyteller. The authority of the flask. Uroscopy had ancient roots. The method was inherited from Hippocrates and Galen, refined by Islamic physicians like Avicenna and Al-Razi, and taught in medical universities across Europe. At Salerno, Montpellier, and Bologna, students studied De Urinis, a treatise dedicated entirely to urine analysis. It was considered both a science and an art. Uroscopy allowed physicians to distance themselves from surgery, which was considered lower status, and to avoid the more indecorous parts of the body. In fact, many elite doctors refused to examine stool or skin lesions. But urine, enclosed in its clear glass vessel, was pure. The macula, a small, round-bottomed urine flask, became the emblem of the physician. It appears in paintings, woodcuts, and manuscripts. A doctor holding a macula was instantly recognized as a learned man. And because urine samples could be transported, diagnosis at a distance became common. A relative might bring a sample from another town, wrapped in cloth and marked with a sigil. The physician would observe it, render a verdict, and send a prescription, never having seen the patient. This was medicine by proxy, but it gave rise to an early form of consultation. You've seen Otto receive samples from as far as Hamburg. Sometimes, he sends his responses with a sealed letter bearing his own wax mark. His reputation has grown because of it. Mystery and misdiagnosis. But not all goes smoothly. A woman brings a sample that appears milky and thick. Otto sniffs it, frowns, then declares it, a sign of blocked menstruation and melancholic vapors. Later, you learn the patient is pregnant. Uroscopy was far from infallible. In fact, it was infamous for its failure to distinguish pregnancy, diabetes, and certain fevers. The urine wheel offered interpretations, but the evidence was often ambiguous. And yet the process had meaning. It offered the illusion of clarity in a world where disease remained mysterious and divine. The flask gave people comfort. Even quacks exploited it. At market fairs, charlatans in robes performed urine readings, making loud declarations about people's fates. Some even changed the urine with herbs to make it appear healthier or sicker, depending on how much money they wanted to collect. You watch Otto with renewed respect. He is not a magician, nor does he pretend to be. He knows his method is imperfect, but he believes in order, in observation, in tradition. And he teaches you to record everything. Because someday, someone will compare these notes and see the patterns. Someday, the coming storm of change. But even now, the whispers have begun. A few young scholars returning from Italy speak of new knowledge dissection, direct observation, challenging Galen. They speak of Vesalius and anatomy lectures, of diseases not caused by imbalance, but by corruption within the body's structure. Otto scoffs. He says they are reckless. Dissecting corpses is indecent. Urine tells you all you need to know. You're not so sure anymore. You've begun to wonder if the truth lies elsewhere beneath the skin, behind the eyes, in the invisible world we can't yet see. But for now, you hold the flask up to the window. The color is dark gold, the sediment fine and settled. According to the chart, it's a sign of strong digestion and balanced humors. You write it down, and you wonder how long will this glass vessel remain the gold standard of diagnosis. And what will happen when doctors stop listening to the urine? You've now spent several seasons as a physician's apprentice, and with each passing week, the glass flasks multiply. They arrive by courier, by servant, by trembling family member holding a cloth-wrapped vessel like an offering to the gods. Some are fresh, warm, and golden. Others arrive spoiled, cloudy, congealed, or smelling foul from long travel. Still, each is examined with solemnity. Your master, Magister Otto, insists on it. Even the worst samples deserve the same dignity. Each represents a person, a child with a wasting illness, a merchant weakened by fever, a nobleman troubled by dark thoughts. In their urine lies the story of their condition, or so Otto still believes. You now know the ritual well. Receive the macula carefully. Note the patient's name, sex, age, and location. Observe the color, clarity, odor, sediment, and whether it separates into distinct layers. Swirl it slowly, watching for clouding or streaking. Consult the urine wheel always, even if you already suspect the result. And most importantly, never contradict the wheel. Reading the flask as reading the soul. Though the process appears scientific, you have begun to sense its symbolic undercurrent. Uroscopy is not just about physiology, it's about character. A patient who produces thick, dark urine may be said to be melancholic, brooding, prone to sadness or excess thought. A pale, watery sample might indicate coldness of temperament, passivity, or laziness. Even emotional states are read through the body's liquid discharge. In this sense, urine becomes a moral mirror. Otto once told a grieving mother that her son's cloudy urine reflected weakness in his humors, caused by indulgence and sloth. She nodded, tearful. Perhaps she believed her child's behavior had summoned his fever. You are less convinced. The boy was starving. But this tendency to moralize disease is not unusual in the 15th century. Illness is rarely seen as accidental. Instead, it reflects imbalance of the body, yes, but also of behavior and belief. Uroscopy then becomes a tool of social judgment, cloaked in diagnosis. Prestige and profit. It is now clear to you that uroscopy brings not only reputation, but revenue. Patients willingly pay to have their urine examined. Even nobles send samples wrapped in linen, tied with string, sometimes accompanied by a pouch of coin. Otto never touches the patient but still earns more than most surgeons or barbers. His clients include guildmasters, merchants, and minor aristocrats. His reputation hinges on certainty even when the outcome is unknowable. You've seen him hesitate. A urine sample from a high-ranking magistrate is red-tinted, cloudy, and thick with sediment. A dangerous mix. But Otto smiles and says, "The blood is strong, the body fights back." The magistrate recovers. Otto's fame grows. When another sample arrives weeks later, nearly identical in appearance, Otto frowns. This time, it's from a cooper's apprentice. He diagnoses a pestilential corruption of the humors. The boy dies within days. You note the inconsistency but say nothing. You are still learning, still watching. Uroscopy and gender. One morning, a woman arrives in person, a rare thing. She is modestly dressed, face veiled, voice low. "I believe I carry child," she whispers and offers her matula. Otto peers into the flask, holds it to the light, and declares, "No, this urine is too pale. There is no life growing in her." She sobs quietly. You feel uncertain. Days later, word reaches you that she collapsed in her home. A midwife called to her aid confirmed she was indeed pregnant but miscarrying. Uroscopy, for all its authority, struggles with the female body. Menstruation, pregnancy, and hormonal changes often confound the interpretations. Yet physicians continue to assert confidence. They issue rulings based on fluid alone. There is a growing divide between learned medicine and women's knowledge midwives, herbalists, and mothers who recognize pregnancy from changes in appetite, complexion, or dreams. You've begun to wonder, might their methods be more accurate? Still, Otto refuses to speak to midwives. He calls their work instinct without intellect. But you've watched them too, and they get things right often more than your master. Challenging the flask. One afternoon, a visiting scholar from Italy arrives. His name is Giovanni, and he has studied in Padua. He brings strange ideas. "Why do we trust the urine and not the tongue?" he asks, "or the pulse, or the breath?" Otto replies sharply, "The urine tells all. It is the final product of the humors." "But it's removed from the body," Giovanni counters. "The tongue still speaks, the eyes still move, the skin changes." He even dares suggest that one might gain more from feeling the patient's wrist, nodding the rhythm of the heartbeat. You are fascinated. This is new. The scholar also discusses a recent manuscript circulating in Italy. Andreas Vesalius, a man who has dissected human bodies, and found that Galen was wrong on many points. Vesalius speaks of real anatomy, not theory, of looking inside the body rather than interpreting its fluids. Giovanni leaves after 3 days. Otto calls him arrogant and dangerous, but you find yourself drawn to his questions. Why do we still rely on the urine? Because it is tradition, because it can be observed without touching the patient, or because it gives us the illusion of control. You begin asking yourself, what if the urine is not enough? The beginnings of change. Your own practice begins to shift. Cautiously, you start asking patients about symptoms before examining the sample. You observe their eyes, skin tone, how they breathe. One man complains of persistent thirst and frequent urination. His urine is pale, clear, and oddly sweet-smelling. Otto calls it a cold stomach. But you suspect otherwise. In an old Arabic text, you find reference to sweet urine disease described centuries before in India and Persia. You begin to suspect that what you're seeing is something distinct, not just an imbalance of humors. And though you don't understand the cause, you begin to see the limits of uroscopy. You see how it groups everything into fixed categories, even when the body speaks differently. Otto notices your curiosity. He warns you, trust the flask, it cannot lie, men do. But you wonder, what if the flask lies by omission? What if it sees only a piece of the whole? You've seen too many misdiagnoses, too many confident pronouncements that ended in death. And now you begin to ask, what comes after the flask, when the urine no longer explains, what will? You stand once again in the familiar light of the physician's chamber. The stained glass flasks still line the window ledge. Their contents glimmer faintly, gold, amber, rust, straw, and cream. It should feel like certainty. But now, after years spent watching men cling to a method more symbolic than scientific, you see the flask for what it truly is. A mirror sometimes clear, sometimes fogged, always partial. It is the year 1492. Your master, Magister Otto, has grown slower, more rigid in his beliefs. His hair is white and he no longer makes house calls. He consults by flask alone now, rarely speaking to the patients whose lives hang on his interpretations. His hands shake slightly when he holds the matula. Still, he commands respect. But the world beyond his study is changing. The rise of clinical observation. In cities like Padua, Montpellier, and Bologna, a quiet revolution brews. Young physicians are beginning to observe the body directly. They examine skin rashes, listen to breath sounds, take patient histories. Some even touch the body, something once considered the work of surgeons, not scholars. You have begun doing the same. You ask patients where it hurts. You observe their posture. You time their pulse by candle drips. You take notes on the order in which symptoms appear. And you test patterns cross-referencing the color of urine with patient outcome instead of just the wheel. You're not alone. A few colleagues exchange observations by letter. You discuss persistent coughs, failed bleedings, and recurring fevers. One writes, "The urine was clear and healthy. The man died the next day." Another, "The matula suggested hot bile but no fever was present." Bit by bit, confidence in pure uroscopy erodes. But Otto remains unmoved. "The urine is the map," he insists. "Do not trust appearances, trust the excretion." And yet, you can no longer ignore what you see. You've observed that. Some with healthy urine die within days. Some with cloudy, foul samples recover fully. Women's urine shifts with their cycle, confounding interpretation. Infants, whose humors are supposedly unformed, display symptoms that do not match any category on the chart. Still, you keep the flasks. Out of respect, yes, but also habit. The flask still offers something the body cannot: distance. You can hold it, swirl it, study it without confronting suffering directly. It is a relic, but also a shield. The printing press and the spread of doubt. By now, the printing press has arrived in your town. Suddenly, texts once copied by hand over months can be printed and distributed across kingdoms. Among the first to be reprinted are medical books, Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, but also new thinkers, Paracelsus, for example, who openly mocks the urine wheel and its loyal readers. "Do not look to the piss," he writes, "but to the man." Paracelsus, for all his eccentricities, is gaining attention. He argues that disease comes from outside the body, from toxins or poisons, not humoral imbalance. He encourages experimentation, chemical remedies, and direct confrontation with illness. The physicians of Nuremberg print a response. A war of words ensues. Otto calls it blasphemy. You quietly read both sides. You begin to see that uroscopy was never just a diagnostic method. It was a system of belief, one that provided order in a chaotic world. In a time before microscopes or thermometers, the flask gave form to the unknown. It distilled suffering into colors, sediment, and scent. But now the veil is lifting. The final lesson. Otto dies in the spring. You find him slumped in his chair, a flask in one hand, a partially written diagnosis in the other. The urine is a pale gold. It looks healthy. He had been coughing for weeks. At his funeral, colleagues speak of his learning, his service to the sick, and his unwavering faith in the ancient texts. They do not mention the cases he misread, the patients he never touched. Afterward, you inherit his practice. You keep his notes, his urine wheel, and his matulae, but you place them on a shelf behind the desk, not in front of it. Now when patients arrive, you ask them how they feel. You look at their eyes. You listen to their breath. You still examine the urine, but as one clue among many, not the singular truth. You train your apprentices the same way. You teach them to doubt, to observe, to question even their own diagnoses. You encourage them to write, to correspond, to share findings. In time, fewer and fewer flasks arrive sealed in cloth. More patients come in person, hopping to be seen as people, not samples. The art of uroscopy does not vanish in an instant. In some towns, physicians still cling to the wheel. In others, it survives only as tradition, a kind of symbolic courtesy. But its grip weakens year by year. And yet, in a strange way, it served its purpose. It taught physicians to observe, to record, to find meaning in patterns, and perhaps most importantly, to seek causes outside the realm of spirits and stars. Reflections in a fatting glass. As you clean the chamber at week's end, you glance at the flasks still lining the window. Dust settles on their shoulders. The sun refracts through them, casting colored light on the walls. They are beautiful, not because they were right, but because they were a beginning. They remind you that even error can lead to truth, that knowledge is not always a torch passed cleanly from one age to the next, but a slow accumulation of questions. The flask asked questions when few dared to. What is illness? Where does it live? Can we know it through the body's waste? Now new tools will ask better questions. But the art of medicine will always begin with the same desire. To see, to understand, to heal. And so you ask yourself, what strange methods will future physicians abandon, and which, in time, will they rediscover? Story 6. The Herbwife's Cabinet, Forgotten Plant Medicines of the Field. It begins not in a library or a monastery, but in a clearing, somewhere along the edge of a 14th century English village. The dawn mist clings to the grass. A woman kneels in the underbrush with a woven basket by her side. She plucks leaves and flowers with practiced fingers, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. She is known by many names: Herbwife, Wise Woman, Wort-Cunner, or simply Marjorie. She cannot read. She has never stepped inside a university or abbey, and yet she holds in her memory the knowledge of generations: how to treat wounds, ease childbirth, soothe fever, and sometimes, though not always, keep death at bay. The sun rises higher and her basket fills with nettle, comfrey, and motherwort. For her, this is not a hobby, it is medicine. And today, you are her apprentice. A cabinet of earthly remedies. Marjorie lives in a small timber-framed cottage at the edge of the village, not far from the sheep pastures. The front door is warped from weather, but the interior is clean and warm. Hanging from the beams are bundles of dried herbs: rosemary, sage, tansy, yarrow, and mugwort. Clay jars line a shelf near the hearth. A wooden chest or cabinet holds roots, powders, and salves. Each item has its purpose. Comfrey root, boiled and mashed, heals bruises and mended bones. She calls it knitbone. Yarrow, applied to wounds, stops bleeding. Chamomile for digestion, calm and sleepless children. Pennyroyal, dangerous, but useful in small doses to regulate a woman's cycles. Betony, said to cure over 20 ailments, from headaches to heartache. She does not use every herb she gathers. Some, like henbane and belladonna, she stores with great caution. A pinch soothes, she says. A handful kills. These are herbs of edge and shadow, used only when other remedies fail. And her tools are humble. A pestle and mortar made of stone. Boiling pots of iron and tin. Cheesecloth for straining. Beeswax for binding. Bottles of wine and vinegar for tinctures. She knows what to harvest by season. Spring brings fresh nettles and cleavers to cleanse the blood. Summer is for flowers: St. John's wort, meadowsweet, and marigold. Autumn yields roots, burdock, dandelion, and valerian. The cabinet is not a piece of furniture. It is a lifetime of practice, a living archive of rural medicine. Patience by path and word. Marjorie does not advertise. She does not hang a shingle or place a sign. People find her because someone they trust has sent them. Today, the first is a young boy with a burn on his hand caused by a too hasty reach into the baking oven. She soaks his hand in cool water, then applies a paste of honey and mashed plant and leaf. Change the dressing every day, she tells his mother. Do not let it dry. Next comes a woman, pale and listless. Her husband says she has not eaten properly in weeks. Marjorie examines her tongue, her fingernails. She listens. Then brews a tea of nettle and dandelion root, meant to cleanse and strengthen the blood. Later, she prepares a bath of rosemary and thyme for a midwife assisting with a difficult labor. The herbs are not for the child, but for the hands that will receive it. Let no sickness be carried in, Marjorie says. No one asks her for a diagnosis in Latin. She offers treatment, not titles. And yet she must walk carefully. Though many depend on her, there are those who eye her with suspicion. The parish priest tolerates her but disapproves of the charms she sometimes uses. She speaks a few words over the herb's old words, passed down from her mother, and the priest calls it superstition. But Marjorie knows the difference between belief and practice. She says her words for comfort. Her herbs do the real work. No books, only memory. You ask her one afternoon if she has ever written down her remedies. She laughs softly. I can't read a word, she says, and if I could, I'd never waste time writing. What I know, I've learned with my hands. She learned from her mother, who learned from hers. This is the oral tradition, deep, personal, and often invisible to history. While monks preserve Galen and Hippocrates, women like Marjorie preserve applied medicine. How long to boil a root, which part of the plant is safest, how to soothe a frightened child at dusk. Her knowledge is empirical, not in theory, but in lived trial and error. And it is, you realize, more widespread than most people admit. Every village has someone like her, a woman with a garden, a cabinet, and a steady hand. Sometimes the remedies work, sometimes they don't, but even failure becomes instruction. When a salve does not heal, she alters the mix. When a tea causes stomach upset, she adjusts the dose. She does not claim to cure everything. Some things, she says, are sent from heaven, and heaven decides when they leave. But she keeps trying. Because to her, healing is not about mastery, it is about stewardship. The quiet resistance. It is easy to forget, but Marjorie's work is a quiet act of resistance. She practices in a world that favors Latin over labor, a world where knowledge is guarded by gatekeepers, monasteries, universities, guilds, a world where the female body is often misunderstood, feared, and left untreated. And yet here she is, day after day, tending to women, children, travelers, and the old. She does not ask for payment, though she accepts eggs, wool, or bread in return. She is healer, neighbor, midwife, and sometimes, when no one else will do it, mourner. You've seen her prepare a remedy for a dying man, not to save him, but to ease his breath and pain. She spoke softly as she rubbed balm onto his chest. There's comfort even in parting, she whispered. There is no ceremony to it, just care. And so you begin to understand. The herbwife's cabinet is not a primitive medical kit. It is a living archive of what people have done for each other in the absence of institutions. It's the history of medicine from the bottom up. From fields, not frescoes. From hands, not hierarchies. And as you hang another bundle of sage to dry, one question roots itself in your mind. When the great physicians write their histories, will they remember the women who healed without books? The seasons shift again. Leaves brown, wine sharpens. You've spent nearly a year at Marjorie's side, and by now you can identify dozens of herbs on sight by scent or even by the shape of their seeds. You know when to harvest roots after the full moon, when the plant's strength pulls downward, and how long to dry calendula blossoms before they lose their potency. You also know what Marjorie doesn't say aloud, that her kind is under threat. The herbwife walks a narrow path between healer and heretic, between essential and expendable. Her work is tolerated in times of peace and necessity, but in moments of panic, suspicion turns quickly to fear. The very knowledge that helps her heal can also bring her danger. And now, with rumors of plague stirring again in nearby towns, the air is growing colder in more ways than one. when healing becomes suspicious. One afternoon, a child from the village disappears into fever delirious, his skin marked with blotches. The local bailiff sends for a true physician from the city. The man arrives in black robes with a red sash and an assistant who carries his satchel. He speaks only to the father. He enters the house alone. Marjorie, who has already visited the family and prepared a tea of wood betony and lemon balm, is told not to return. The boy dies that night. The physician leaves without explanation. A few villagers begin whispering that the boy grew worse after Marjorie's visit, that perhaps the tea was too strong, that the herbs were wrong, that the fever was a punishment and she tried to interfere with God's will. You know it isn't true, but truth isn't always the measure. Marjorie says little. She tightens the knots on her bundles. She sharpens her knife for cutting roots. Her work continues quieter now, but no less deliberate. The role of the cunning folk. Marjorie's type of healing has always existed alongside official medicine. Throughout medieval Europe, cunning folk, both women and men, provided herbal remedies, charms, dream interpretation, and weather readings. Their skills varied by region. In some places, they were deeply respected. In others, they were barely tolerated. The church often walked a fine line, condemning magic but relying on herbalists to keep rural communities healthy where no clerics or physicians would go. Marjorie is no witch. She speaks of saints as often as she speaks of roots, but she does use charms, simple rhymes spoken over wounds or during childbirth. They are never meant to summon spirits or curse enemies. They are words of comfort, rhythm, and familiarity. Still, even these can be misinterpreted. She tells you a story of a healer she once knew in Kent, a woman named Alisoun. She treated a fevered man with a poultice and recited a charm for protection. Days later, when the man died, the family accused her of bewitching him. A magistrate ordered her arrested. She was never seen again. There was no trial, no questioning, just silence. You begin to realize the knowledge in Marjorie's cabinet is not only practical but political. To heal without license, without male authority, is a risk. But to not heal, to withhold help from those in need, is something Marjorie refuses to do. Plant trials and remedies that persist. Despite the danger, she continues testing and refining her treatments. She keeps a wax tablet near the hearth where she carves notes, scratches that only she can interpret, a code of symbols for dosages, combinations, and observations. This season, she's been experimenting with horehound boiled with honey for persistent coughs, lady's mantle for excessive bleeding during menstruation, fumitory mixed with vinegar to relieve itchy skin, woodruff steeped in ale to calm restless sleep. You watch her test one batch on herself first, always herself. Only after she observes the effects will she give it to someone else. Sometimes it works. Sometimes she adjusts. Always she learns. There is no applause, no publication, just quiet results. You begin keeping your own notes, hidden inside a leather pouch. It's dangerous to be seen as a woman with too much knowledge, but you write them anyway. Because you believe what Marjorie believes, that healing matters, even when no one is watching. Midwives' magic and the line that moves. Midwifery, too, is part of Marjorie's work. She's delivered dozens of bobbies, some in warmth and safety, others in stormlit cottages with only rags and a prayer. She uses raspberry leaf tea to strengthen contractions, angelica root to encourage afterbirth, and lavender oil to calm the mother's breath. She never makes guarantees. She reminds you that not every child arrives safely, not every mother survives. Still, when Marjorie is present, women feel less afraid. She speaks gently. She keeps their dignity intact. She waits until the baby's first breath before she allows herself to breathe. But recently, the priest has begun questioning her involvement in births. There should be a churching after every child, he says, and we should not allow superstitions at so sacred a moment. He means the charms, the herbs, the warm oils and whispered rhymes. Marjorie nods politely, but she doesn't stop. Because she knows, when labor begins in the dark, when pain takes hold, it is not a priest who kneels beside the bed. It is her. And her work is not superstition, it is survival. A visit from the sheriff. One morning, a writer appears. The sheriff's seal is burned into the wax of a letter. A man in a nearby village has fallen ill after drinking a tincture not made by Marjorie, but by someone else. A traveling peddler, perhaps. No one knows. Still, her name is mentioned. The sheriff doesn't arrest her. He merely asks questions. What herbs does she use? Who trained her? Has she ever caused harm? She answers calmly. She shows him her clean jars, her labeled salves, her dried bundles. He finds no devil's symbols, no poisons, no books of spells. And yet, as he leaves, he glances back at the hanging yarrow and mutters, "Be careful, there are eyes watching." You feel the change in the air again, not winter, suspicion. Later that night, Marjorie burns a few of her more dangerous herbs, henbane, wolfsbane, and dried nightshade. Too easy to misunderstand, she says. Let fire erase what fear would twist. She locks her cabinet for the first time in months. And as the smoke rises, you wonder, how much wisdom has been lost this way, not through ignorance but through fear? How many cures have been destroyed not because they failed, but because they were forbidden? How many women, nameless now, once held healing in their hands? It is late spring now, and Marjorie's garden is beginning to swell with green. Chickweed creeps between rows of planted tansy. Elderflower trees have begun to bloom behind the cottage. You know every root, stem, and seed by now. But the world beyond her garden continues to turn in ways that feel unfamiliar and dangerous. You've heard the rumors spreading from village to village, whispers of witch trials in East Anglia, of women accused of casting the evil eye, of midwives blamed when newborns die, of herbwives summoned to courts not for their healing, but for what others believe their healing represents. The fear is no longer local. It's systemic. And Marjorie, despite her years of service, her compassion, her skill has come into the sightline of a world that now seeks control, not comfort. Healing in the shadow of the church. The church has always had a complicated relationship with folk healers. On the one hand, it needs them. Priests do not know how to deliver bobbies. Monks do not travel muddy roads to treat fevers or lameness in the elderly. In rural communities, where physicians rarely tread, the herbwife is the only practitioner within reach. But on the other hand, the church fears what it cannot command. Marjorie's remedies exist outside Scripture. Her knowledge is not found in the Latin texts of Galen or Avicenna. Her skills are passed woman to woman, unwritten, unregulated, and therefore uncontrollable. And now, a new push begins, led by men with titles and robes and printing presses. They seek to define what counts as legitimate medicine, to limit healing to those trained in universities, to bring all health under theological authority. In this new world, there is less room for someone like Marjorie, or someone like you. The inventory. One day, with little warning, the local bailiff arrives. He brings with him 2 scribes and a scribe's apprentice. "We're here," he says, "to make an inventory." They enter Marjorie's cottage and begin cataloging everything: dried roots, jars of oil, labeled bundles of herbs, even her mortar and pestle. They copy symbols they do not recognize. They ask her what each item is used for, though their tone suggests they do not plan to believe her. Marjorie complies. She does not argue. She explains each herb plainly, patiently. This is valerian root for troubled sleep. This is heartstung fern for sores and burns. This is rue for cleansing the home. The bailiff narrows his eyes at that last one. For charms, he asks. For scent, she replies simply. When they leave, the cottage feels violated. The shelves are untouched, but something has shifted. The trust once quietly extended to her has been broken. They didn't come for justice. They came to build a case. And both of you know it. Disappearance and silence. That summer, 2 other herbwives from nearby villages vanish. One was known to treat livestock illness with a powder of dried elder bark. Another helped women with fertility tinctures. No one speaks of them directly, but their cottages are empty, their gardens overgrown. One still has herbs drying from her eaves. Marjorie becomes more cautious. She no longer treats strangers. She refuses to assist births beyond the edge of the village. Her cabinet, once full and open, is now locked more often than not. I won't give them reason, she says, but the fear has already taken root. She gives you a small book handwritten with smudged ink and oil-stained pages. Not everything, she says, but enough. It contains recipes, dosages, warnings. She's never trusted paper, but she trusts you. Keep it hidden, she says, and use it only when needed. You realize then, Marjorie is preparing for a world where she no longer exists, not by death but by erasure. She's not just giving you knowledge. She's asking you to carry it forward. When the smoke rises, it finally happens in late autumn. A man well-liked in the village claims his illness came from a tea Marjorie gave him. Never mind that he'd drunk deeply at the tavern for days before. Never mind that he also saw a monk for confession and a barber for bloodletting. His fever grows worse, and the villagers, once quietly grateful, begin to turn. One morning, the priest does not meet your eyes. The blacksmith's wife, once a regular visitor for sage and chamomile, crosses to the other side of the road. And then an official summons. Marjorie is to appear before the justices of the peace. The charges are vague: sorcery, unauthorized healing, and the possession of harmful plants. You offer to go with her. She refuses. If I bring you, she says, they'll mark you too. She goes alone. She never returns. No one tells you what happened. No official word. No written notice. Only a whispered comment from a friendly baker who heard something from a man who saw smoke on the edge of a distant field. You bury the cabinet in the earth behind the cottage. You scatter seeds in its place: yarrow, valerian, tansy, and betony. You carry her book and her silence, legacy rooted in earth. Years later, when the winds have shifted again, you begin quietly treating neighbors. Only those who ask directly. Only those who remember. The plants grow still, even if the world does not. You hear talk of new movements in medicine: men in cities dissecting cadavers, testing minerals, writing in great detail. It is progress, yes, but it also forgets. For while formal medicine builds cathedrals of theory, your work remains rooted in soil. In watching, in patience, in care. The herbwife's cabinet was never just a chest of remedies. It was an archive of the marginalized, a legacy held not in ink, but in memory, in hands that tilled, dried, brewed, and healed long before the institutions knew how to spell their names. And as you write down another remedy in your own book carefully, plainly you think, what knowledge still hides beneath the hedgerow, waiting to be remembered?